It is the night of August 22nd, 1914. In a quiet French village east of Nancy, a column of soldiers in bright blue coats and red trousers moves forward at the quick step. Their officers ride ahead on horseback. Their bayonets are fixed, long, gleaming blades of steel mounted to the ends of their libello rifles, catching what little moonlight filters through the trees. They have been told the enemy is demoralized, that French élan, spirit, aggression, the will to win, is the decisive force in war, that a man who charges boldly, with steel in his hand and fire in his heart, cannot be stopped. What they are about to discover will unmake everything they believe. The German lines open up. Machine guns, artillery. The sound of the modern battlefield, a sound unlike anything recorded in the manuals these men were trained on, erupts in every direction. The men in red trousers fall by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. On that single day, August 22nd, 1914, the French army loses approximately 27,000 men killed. It is the bloodiest single day in all of French military history. More French soldiers die on that one day than on any other day of the entire 4-year war. The bayonet they carried into that slaughter, it barely draws blood. And that is the story we're here to tell today. Not the story of a weapon that ruled the battlefield, but the story of a weapon that was supposed to. A weapon whose real power lived almost entirely inside the minds of the men who held it and the men who feared it. If you want military history told the way it actually happened, no mythology, no shortcuts, no comfortable lies, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell. These stories deserve to be told straight. To understand why the bayonet became a psychological symbol rather than a battlefield killer in the First World War, you have to understand the world it came from. For nearly 2 centuries, the bayonet had been the decisive weapon of infantry warfare. Since the late 1600s, when socket bayonets first allowed a soldier to fire his musket and still have a blade at the ready, the image of massed infantry with steel fixed had defined how wars were fought and won. Waterloo, Gettysburg, the slopes of a dozen forgotten hills in a dozen forgotten wars. Bayonets had ended charges, broken squares, and driven men from trenches with a shock of cold steel and screaming voices that caused entire formations to dissolve. Armies trained their men in bayonet drill with religious seriousness. The British Army's Manual of Bayonet Training, published in 1913, just 1 year before the war, provided meticulous instructions on the thrust, the parry, the butt strike. Generations of young soldiers had stood in parade grounds with their instructors shouting at them to get their angle right, to drive from the hip, to recover quickly after the lunge. The manual described the bayonet as a weapon for close quarters, effective against an enemy who could not withstand the psychological shock of men advancing with steel. And that last part, the psychological shock, was key. Even the trainers who produced these manuals understood that the bayonet's deadliest attribute was not the wound it made. It was the terror it produced in the person who saw it coming. There is something uniquely primal about a blade. A bullet is abstract. You cannot see it. You cannot hear it until it has already passed. You feel nothing, and then you are either alive or you are not. A bayonet is different. It is visible. It catches the light. The sound of steel scraping against a rifle barrel as a man fixes it is audible at distance. The sight of a line of men advancing with bayonets leveled, bayonets gleaming, bayonets aimed directly at your position. That sound and that sight produce something very old and very deep in the human nervous system. Something pre-rational. Something that bypasses the thinking mind and goes directly to the animal brain, which is saying one thing only: run. That psychological function was real. It was documented. It was understood by military professionals on both sides of every war the bayonet had ever been used in. The British Army trained with it at least as much for the confidence and aggression it built in the men who wielded it as for the actual wounds it could inflict. An infantry soldier who was confident with the bayonet, who had drilled with it until it felt like an extension of his body, was a more aggressive soldier. He would advance. He would not hesitate at the last moment. He would, if necessary, go forward into the fire. But August 1914 was not like any battlefield the bayonet had ever seen before. The French went to war with a doctrine called offensive à l'outrance, offense to the extreme. Its foundation was the belief that morale and aggression would always defeat firepower if the will was strong enough. Plan 13, the French army's opening strategy, called for a headlong offensive into Alsace-Lorraine to recapture the territories France had lost in 1871. 5 armies would advance. French élan would carry them forward at the point of the bayonet. The Germans would be swept from the field. It was a doctrine built for the battles of Napoleon's era, being applied to a world of magazine rifles, barbed wire, and the MG-08, the standard German heavy machine gun, capable of firing over 400 rounds per minute with a sustained, devastating accuracy that nothing in French military theory had fully accounted for. A young French officer named Charles de Gaulle, who survived those opening months, later wrote that all the courage in the world cannot prevail against gunfire. He was right. And the armies of Europe spent the next 4 years learning it the hard way. The slaughter of August and September 1914 was unlike anything recorded in the history of modern warfare. The French lost over 300,000 men killed in the first 5 months of the war. The British Expeditionary Force, considered the most professional army on the European continent, was effectively destroyed within months of arriving in France. The German advance drove deep into France before being stopped at the Marne in September 1914. Then, exhausted, bled white, with their supply lines stretched to breaking, both sides did something that would define the next 4 years. They dug. The race to the sea, the frantic maneuvering of autumn 1914, as each side tried to outflank the other, ended when there was no more flank to turn. From Switzerland to the English Channel, nearly 400 miles of trenches were cut into the earth of France and Belgium. And in that trench world, the old weapons of war, the bayonet among them, found themselves in an environment they had never been designed for. Think about what the bayonet was actually meant to do. It was designed for open field warfare. A line of men advancing across flat ground, closing with the enemy at a deliberate march, presenting a wall of steel that would either stop the opposing line cold, because most men, when they see several hundred bayonets coming at them, make a rational decision to leave, or drive home into a defended position and clear it with the violence of close combat. What the bayonet was not designed for was a trench. A trench in the First World War was typically about 7 feet deep, wide enough for 2 men to pass and full of right-angle turns called traverses, designed specifically to limit the damage of a grenade or shell exploding inside it. The men inside wore full kit, heavy packs, pouches, helmets. They lived in a space barely wide enough to extend your arms. Now try to use a bayonet in that environment. A British Lee Enfield rifle was just over 4 feet long. Fix a 17-inch sword bayonet to the end of it, and you have a weapon over 5.5 feet long, in a trench that is perhaps 3 feet wide. The moment you try to thrust at someone who is 6 feet in front of you, you are driving the weapon into a wall of earth. If you succeed in stabbing the man and he grabs the blade, which wounded men instinctively did, clutching at anything that had penetrated their body, you cannot pull it back without wrenching the rifle from his grip or leaving the bayonet behind. Soldiers discovered these limitations very quickly, and the battlefield improvised, as soldiers always do. The clubs appeared first, rough wooden handles weighted with metal, iron bars with hobnails hammered through the striking end, medieval maces in all but name, designed not to stab, which requires distance and leverage, but to crush, which can be done in the time and space of a single heartbeat. Trench raiding parties, the small, deadly teams that crept across no man's land at night to gather intelligence and take prisoners, went in with blackened faces, carrying clubs, knives, hatchets, and entrenching tools with sharpened edges. The trench knife came next, shortened bayonets reforged into push daggers. The American M1917 knuckle duster trench knife with its triangular blade and brass knuckle guard. The German Nahkampfmesser, so effective that it was carried again in the Second World War. The French demobilized entire factories of civilian cutlery workers to produce knives fast enough to meet the demand. And the entrenching shovel, the humble folding spade every infantryman carried to dig his own position, became perhaps the most feared weapon in the trenches. Its blade could be sharpened to an edge. Its short handle fit perfectly in the confines of a trench. In the right hands, it could be used to hack, slash, and thrust with a speed and versatility that a fixed bayonet simply could not match. So where did the bayonet go? It went to a role it had always been suited for, even if that role was never quite what the training manuals described. It became fear. On July 1st, 1916, the British Army launched its assault on the German lines along the Somme River. It was the largest offensive the British Empire had ever mounted. 100,000 men went over the top at 7:30 in the morning. They had been told the week-long artillery bombardment would destroy the German wire, collapse the German dugouts, and leave nothing alive on the other side of no man's land. They went forward at a walk, bayonets fixed, trusting in the plan. The plan was wrong. The German dugouts were deep, 30, 40 feet underground in some sectors, and the men in them survived the barrage and came up fighting. The barbed wire, in many places, was still intact. The German machine guns opened up across open ground. By the end of that first day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties. Of those, 19,240 men were dead. It remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. Bayonet wounds were so rare in that catastrophe, in the entire First World War, that British military hospitals logged them under miscellaneous wounds in their record books. They didn't even have their own category. 2/3 of all casualties on the Western Front were produced by artillery shells. Machine gun and rifle fire accounted for most of the rest. The bayonet, the weapon that every soldier carried, the weapon they had drilled with for months, the weapon whose gleam was supposed to break the enemy's nerve, produced a statistical rounding error, and yet, not one army abandoned it. Not one general ordered his men to leave their bayonets behind. Not one training program stopped teaching the thrust, the parry, the butt strike. Through 4 years of a war that rewrote everything men thought they knew about how fighting worked, the bayonet remained fixed to the end of every rifle, carried into every assault, issued to every man in the line. Why? Because the bayonet was not really a weapon anymore. It was a tool of psychology. And in that role, it was irreplaceable. Consider what a bayonet charge actually accomplished in the First World War. Not in terms of casualties inflicted, but in terms of what it did to the men being charged. There is no documented tactic in the entire history of warfare that produces surrender faster than a bayonet charge. Men who would stand and fight through artillery, through machine gun fire, through gas, through everything the industrial age could throw at them, would break, drop weapons, and raise their hands when they saw men coming at them across open ground with cold steel. This was not irrational. It was deeply rational. A man who surrenders to infantry with rifles can reasonably expect to become a prisoner of war. A man who has to be physically overcome, who has to be fought to the ground, stabbed, struggled with, is going to die. The bayonet announced without words that the fight was now going to be decided at arm's length, and that the question of who lived and who died would be settled in the next 3 seconds. Men chose not to find out. German veterans who survived the war wrote accounts of seeing British or French troops appear over the lip of a trench with bayonets leveled, and of the immediate, overwhelming impulse to throw up their hands. It was not cowardice. It was the oldest calculation in combat. Is there still a way out? And when men with blades were close enough to touch you, the calculation came up clearly on one side. The British Army understood this perfectly. Their training literature was explicit about it. The bayonet was intended as much to drive the enemy from his position as to wound or kill. The threat of it, the sight of it, the knowledge that it was there. And there was something else the bayonet did, something harder to quantify but equally real. It made the men who carried it willing to move forward. Every assault in the First World War required men to stand up, leave cover, and walk or run across open ground toward other men who were trying to kill them. The fear involved in that action was immense. It was not normal fear, the ordinary anxiety of everyday life, but a deep, body-level terror produced by the proximity of artillery shells, the crack of bullets, the sight of men falling around you. Military psychologists and historians who have studied the First World War agree that one of the central challenges of infantry command was not training men to fire their weapons, but simply getting them to move, to stand up, to go forward when every instinct they possessed was screaming at them to stay down. Bayonet training addressed that challenge in a way that was surprisingly effective. A soldier who had drilled with the bayonet until the movements were automatic, who had practiced the lunge, the parry, the recovery, had a script for close combat. He knew what to do when the distance closed. That knowledge gave him permission to close the distance. The bayonet was, in this sense, a confidence mechanism. It told the soldier, when you get there, you will not be helpless. You will know what to do. The U.S. Army's own internal studies acknowledged this directly. After reviewing the training given to American troops preparing to deploy to France in 1917 and 1918, analysts noted that bayonet training instilled a fighting spirit and individual aggressiveness, even though the men had few actual occasions to use the weapon in hand-to-hand combat. The training's real value was what it did to the soldier before the fighting started, not what the bayonet did during it. There is a final dimension to this story that deserves to be told because it is the most human part of all. The men in the trenches of the Western Front lived in conditions that are almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced them. Mud that could swallow a man, rats that fed on the bodies of the dead, the constant, unending sound of artillery, day and night, week after week, that produced what the Army called shell shock and what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. Men who had been in the line for weeks had a look that their comrades could identify at a glance. The 1,000-yard stare, the involuntary flinch, the shaking hands. In that environment, morale was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between an army that could still function and one that could not. And the tools of morale were often surprising in their simplicity. The bayonet was one of them. It was a visible symbol of offensive intent. It said, "We are not merely defending ourselves. We are going to take ground. We are going to close with the enemy. We are going forward." In a war that seemed to offer nothing but stalemate and attrition, the sight of a line of men with bayonets fixed, going over the top, going forward, going toward the sound of the guns, carried a meaning that went far beyond what the blade could actually do. It was a statement of will, of refusal, of the insistence that, whatever the machine guns and the artillery and the gas and the mud had to say about the matter, men were still going to stand up and advance. The enemy who heard the sound of those bayonets being fixed, the audible scrape of steel on steel echoing along a trench in the darkness before an assault, understood what that sound meant. And sometimes that understanding was enough. When the war finally ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the survivors came home carrying a weapon that had barely drawn blood in 4 years of the most industrialized killing in human history. But the bayonet had done something else, something quieter and in its own way more important. It had helped men go forward. It had given armies the courage to close the distance, to move through the fire across no man's land toward the men on the other side. Most of the time, the bayonet was never used once they got there. A grenade was faster, a club was more practical, a shovel edge was more effective in the confines of a trench. But the bayonet had gotten them there. And sometimes, just the sight of it coming was enough to end the fight before it started. There is a lesson in that for anyone willing to look for it. The weapons that decide wars are not always the weapons that draw blood. Sometimes the decisive weapon is the one that determines whether men will stand up and go forward at all. The bayonet of the First World War was almost never used, and it was absolutely essential. If this story moved you, if you believe these men's experiences deserve to be remembered honestly, without mythology, please subscribe, hit the like button, and ring the bell. Every subscriber keeps this work going. We'll see you on the next one.